Northway, how you doing this weekend? Great to see you, whatever campus, location you are participating at. Last week's sermon by Pastor Kent was about 4 words. You remember what they were? Don't offend him. Come on, everybody, all campuses, all skate. What were the 4 words last week? Ready? Love each other deeply. Well done. Originally, Kent's sermon was to be the end of this series, but we decided to add a 6th week. So I am closing out this First Peter series, and then we'll come back to Peter again at the end of the summer, later on in August. If you remember in the first week, Pastor Scott set this series up. He said there are going to be 3 themes in First Peter that we were going to discuss: belief, suffering, and loving one another. And after spending 2 weeks on challenging whether or not we are believers, and spending 2 weeks saying, you're going to suffer and you're going to like it, we only gave you 1 week on love. So we decided we'd give you 1 more. So I'm up here to talk about loving one another. So, love each other deeply, 4 words, 2 sermons. Today I'm going to be in several different parts of 1 Peter, and I just want to begin with the first verse. As I'm going through this, I'm going to stop several times and just, I'm going to literally just ask you to write down maybe an application, maybe something the Lord's speaking to you. Might not even have been anything I said. Might have been something that he's just impressing on your heart. And so probably 3 or 4 times I'm going to stop. If you don't have anything, that's okay. But if you do, I just want you to write it down. If you're a Twitter user, authorization of using your phone is given, and you may tweet. And we've got a hashtag up for you about loving each other deeply. So we begin in verse 1. Peter, it says, an apostle of Jesus Christ, he's writing, to those who are elect exiles scattered, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. One of the themes in the scriptures is the idea of an exile. Did you know that? Old Testament, New Testament, it appears often. God talks about his people as exiles. An exile, as we all know, is someone who's living away from their home. They're in a foreign land, and it can be for any number of reasons, but for whatever reason it is, they are living away from the place that is their home. And so they're in a foreign territory. And Peter begins his letter by addressing the early Christians as exiles. And the same comes to us. Every one of us, we're exiles. We know spiritually this earth is not our home. Our home is with Jesus Christ in eternity. And so this place is where we are exiled. Church, every one of us are exiles. But, as is the theme we're talking about this week, we are not to be exiles alone. That's not the design. In fact, this is what the entire sermon is focused on, this idea of being an exile and not being an exile alone. Because as exiles, we either grow and thrive together in community, or we barely survive and don't grow at all alone. Let's be honest, church. So many of us desire deeply to grow and thrive in this life. And we desire to do that with others. But our experience has been survival at best. There's a sociologist from Harvard. His name is Robert Putnam. You've probably heard of him. He's got a book called Bowling Alone. You don't need to go buy this book unless you are a pop sociology nerd and you would enjoy reading such things. I did read it. He spent years poring over research, and he's talking about the falling apart and the lack of community today in America. That we've become increasingly disconnected from family and friends and neighbors and the structures that have made our society what it is. And he gives an incredible amount of evidence in the book. He talks about the long amount of time that so many spend commuting, going to and from work. He talks about the lack of family dinners, the amount of time we no longer spend inviting people into our home, and so on and so forth. He proclaims at one point, he says, our national myths often exaggerate the role of individual heroes and understate the importance of collective effort. The whole point of his research is that America, we all want to be, the hero by themselves, but deep down, none of us want to be that. We want to be a hero, but alongside other people. And what's interesting in his research, which is the whole reason I bring it up, is because he points to one piece of society where he says there's probably hope for those who want community in America. Do you want to know what it is? Strangely enough, based on his research, it's the church. He ends up discussing the church in a positive manner. He calls it an incubator for the type of community so many Americans miss and long for, and we only see in TV shows that talk about the good old days. So here's a secular researcher talking about loving each other deeply and how it's evidentially needed today in our country and in our city, perhaps more than ever. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but this one we can't agree with. Right? I mean, just a few conversations that you or I could have with some people in our neighborhood. Or maybe just observing people in our workplace or out in the world somewhere. We can all see the struggle to know one another is a deep struggle that so many experience. It's a struggle for us to love one another deeply and to also feel that love. But it's not just the struggle of those outside the church, is it? It's something that happens in the church. And I just want to encourage you here. I want to challenge you. I want to ask you two questions. How are you doing loving each other deeply in the church? And how are you doing allowing others to love you deeply? They're different questions. I want to start with the second one. Several weeks ago, our pastors were meeting, the campus pastors and Pastor Scott. And Pastor Scott McCabe from Swickley Valley, who has been pastoring longer than I have been putting on my own clothes, was telling a little bit of a story. And because he's been pastoring so much longer than me, I was listening intently because he was talking about prayer. We've been talking a lot as a group about prayer. And he had said that just in Swickley, several weeks ago, maybe about a month and a half ago, he actually, in the middle of his service, he stood up and he said, hey, I'd love to pray for you. All the campus pastors, we've been trying to get time into our schedules, a couple hours every week, to be able to pray for our communities, our campuses, and our locations. And he said, would you just take some time, Swickley, to write down your prayers? And he was just overwhelmed. He brought to our pastor meeting this stack of communicator cards. And I was like, wow, I've never thought of that before. So a couple weeks ago in Oakland, I pulled a Scott McCabe and just made a little bit of time in the service, and I asked, and I was overwhelmed with communicator cards from our 3 services. Had a stack this big, and spent time praying with him a week ago, again this week. And you know what I realized? We're all struggling with a lot of stuff. We all need prayer for a lot of things. We all want people to stand with us in prayer. But do you want to know what the loneliest time at Northway is? Every single Sunday? It's the life of an elder and his wife after the service, because nobody ever comes up for prayer. And I think part of it is because so many of us, me included, we don't want to tell people what we're struggling with. We don't want to allow people to love us deeply. We'll do it on a card because it's a little anonymous. And so I just want to encourage you, Northway. Maybe that's a simple way that we as a church could allow each other in. Maybe it's in your small group. You've got to allow them to love you by sharing something going on in your life. Maybe it is after a service at one of your locations, and you come on up. The second question I asked is, how are we doing loving one another deeply inside the church? Put this another way, how are we doing it reaching out to one another? It connecting those that we actually are in a church community with. And how many people in these communities in our different locations are actually alone when they're at church and they come and go anonymously? The Christmas before my wife and I had our first son, so about a little over 6 years ago, we decided to not travel that Christmas. It was going to be our last Christmas without kids, and we didn't feel like getting everything in the car. We had done the in-laws on both sides for the last several years. We said, okay, we're just going to stay in Pittsburgh. And I was still up here sort of pastoring at the Wexford campus, and so we were up here for the Christmas Eve services. And we decided, because we didn't have any plans, we were just going to hang out at the last couple services and just hopefully get invited over for dinner to someone's house. And we stood around for a long time. And we hung out in the lobby, and we gave hugs, and we said Merry Christmas to a lot of people that we knew. And even some people were like, what are you guys doing for Christmas? And we were just like, well, we're just staying here. Nothing much going on. What are you guys doing? And nobody invited us over for dinner. So we got in our cars, and we went home, and we barely made it to a really bad pizza restaurant in Bellevue where we ordered pizza, and we watched The Preacher's Wife on DVD and had our little cardboard pizza Christmas Eve dinner. And I hope some of you feel bad. Very funny, silly point. We really weren't offended. But if that happens to a pastor on Christmas Eve, how many people is that happening to every single weekend at every location? People that come and go anonymously. People that desire for us to love them deeply, and they want it. But we don't even see them, or we don't think to ask them. Some of our small groups have been going for 10 or 15 years at this church. When was the last time you had somebody new join? When was the last time your small group multiplied out and took some new ground and invited others in? Some of you, when you first came to Northway, maybe months ago, maybe years ago, you weren't connected at all. Now that you are connected, have you yet turned around to look and see who isn't, who's just like you were years ago? And have you done something to get them connected? Church, how you doing at loving someone else deeply just in our own community? Because that's where it starts, right? Because remember, as exiles, we either grow and thrive together, or we barely survive and don't grow at all alone. An old church father in about 200, his name was Tertullian, and he was talking about this. Interestingly, he talks about the idea of branding, which I think is really funny. It's an old idea, not a new one. He says this: the practice of a special love brands us. He's talking about Christians in the eyes of some. See, they say, how they love one another and how ready they are to die for each other. We call ourselves brothers, so we who are united in mind and soul have no hesitation about sharing what we have. Everything is in common among us except our wives. Well, that's an important point. That type of love is what's communicated to us in the scriptures, not just in Peter, all over the scriptures. That's what it means to love each other deeply. And do you know what? This early church, about a generation and a half after this, 60 years after, they were tested. They were tested deeply because a plague broke out. And people began to die by the thousands. And here's one letter about the character of the Christian community by a guy named Dionysius. Listen to this. I'm not going to put it up on the screens because I just want you to listen to it and listen to the imagery, the description of what's happening as the plague overtakes, in this case, a particular town, Alexandria. He's talking about Christians. He says, our brethren, in their exceeding love and affection for the brotherhood, were unsparing of themselves and clave to one another, visiting the sick without a thought as to the danger, tending them in Christ. And so most gladly departed this life along with them, being infected with the disease from others, drawing upon themselves the sickness of their neighbors, and willingly taking over their pains. In this manner the best of our brethren departed this life. And so too, the bodies of the saints they would take up in their open hands to their bosom, closing their eyes and shutting their mouths, and carrying on their shoulders and laying them out. They would cling to them, embrace them, bathe them, and adorn them with burial clothes, and after a little while receive the same services themselves. For those who were left behind were ever following those that went before. But the conduct of the heathen was the exact opposite. Even those who were in the first state of the disease, they thrust away, and they fled from even their dearest family. They would even cast them in the roads half dead and treat the unburied corpses as trash. You see, early on when the church was tested, they put their money where their mouth was, and they died caring for others. They weren't even being persecuted. It was an imminent death. They knew that if they cared for these people, they too would have the disease and they would die and someone else would have to care for them. Yet they kept going, every one of them, loving each other deeply. That's the type of love that the gospel tells us is to mark the Christian community. And it's what, using Tertullian's phrase, brands us as different from those who are not a part of our community. Those who, in this case, threw bodies of even their own family members into the streets. Peter continues this deep love theology that we're talking about. And in chapter 2, I want to read one verse, and then I'm going to kind of talk about the context a little bit. This is one of my favorite verses in the scriptures. It says this: honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. How's that for a slogan? You're looking for your first verse to memorize? Here it is. Peter says clearly what our life is to be like. We're to honor everyone. We're to love our spiritual family. We're to fear or revere God. And we are to honor the emperor. We're going to come back to that part in a little bit. Several months ago, in October, we had Halloween. And I know that all Christians don't celebrate Halloween, and I understand, and I get it. But in my family, it's one of the few nights of the year where all of our neighbors are out on their front porches, and we love to go out and be among them and have people on our porch and go with others. And we wanted to get a costume together for our boys, the two older ones that were trick-or-treating. The youngest one wasn't really doing much at that point. And we were thinking about these costumes, trying to find the stuff that wasn't like, goblins and witches and just these grotesque figures, right, that would scare me. And so we landed on two costumes. And here they are. Cohen is the older one. He's dressed up as a knight, and every knight needs a good chicken as a sidekick. So that's his little brother, Tavin. Notice Cohen's shield. I didn't do this for the purpose of a sermon illustration. I just got caught up in a daddy moment in the basement with some cardboard and a Sharpie. And I figured, wow, one of my favorite verses, that would make a good shield, wouldn't it? And so on the front it says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God. And I made this little holder for him out of cardboard in the back. That's about as handy as I get, okay? And I wrote on the back a little cheat sheet for the verse number because I thought someone might ask him what it was. So it said 1 Peter 2:1-7. And several times over the course of the night, we'd knock and trick or treat, and it'd be bark, 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 bark from the little brother, and then Cohen would just stand there like a knight and wait for someone to ask him. About 4 times, someone asked him, what is that from? And he'd say, 1 Peter 2:17. We weren't obnoxious. We weren't walking around the neighborhood speaking the gospel through a bullhorn. We weren't dressed like Peter, Paul, and Mary throwing out tracts instead of Snicker bars, all right? It was just a really small little way to bring a little bit of light of Christ into Halloween. And it was appropriate for us to do a little proclaiming in the neighborhood. People know I'm a pastor, and it was appropriate. More so than that, as parents of 3 boys, the blue life, as we talk about it, we have been seeking to try to find a way to raise them up to know the Lord. And we've kind of attached ourselves to this idea of being a modern day knight for Jesus and talking about, nobility and purity and fighting for injustice and these types of things. And so we talk about this often, so it made sense. The idea of a knight, historically, it was a person who was sent to a foreign land to undergo a life and death ordeal. But a knight would never be sent alone. He was always sent with others. And they would fight injustice, and they always had a brotherhood around them. A French knight in 1465 talked about this brotherhood as they were fighting. And this French knight said this: "We love each other so much in battle. If we see that our cause is just and our kinsmen fight boldly, tears come to our eyes." I know what you're thinking. Knights don't cry. Well, he's French. Isn't Chevalier French? I'm just thinking it is. "A sweet joy," he goes on, "rises in our hearts in the feeling of our honest loyalty to each other and seeing our friend so bravely exposing his body to danger in order to fulfill the commandment of our Creator. We resolve to go forward and die or live with him on account of love. This brings such delight that anyone who has not felt it cannot say how wonderful it is. Do you think someone who feels this is afraid of death? Not in the least. He's so strengthened, so delighted that he doesn't even know where he is. Truly, he fears nothing in the world." Church of Vision, what if we as exiles could see ourselves as spiritual knights in this world. Men and women, not wielding swords in offense, but in honoring everyone and fearing God. Waging war, as Scott talked about in week 1, against sin, not only in our lives, but sin in the world. Sweet joy rising in our hearts, loyalty to one another, bravely fighting alongside each other for the values of our King. Loving each other deeply as long as we are exiles, while being foreigners engaged in a spiritual life or death battle. What does that look like? This is where the context comes in 3 quick points based on the second chapter of Peter that leads us to that verse 17. Beginning in verse 4, here's what Peter says: as you come to him, Christ, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Peter here gives us an incredible theological description of us as priests. This was revolutionary to the Jewish ears because their priests were set apart from everybody else. They were the only ones who could relate and talk to God for themselves or for other people. And Peter says, no, we all do that now. Later, during the Reformation in the 1500s, this idea of the priesthood of all believers became incredibly important again because the priesthood had sort of grown up in the Catholic Church and it again was sort of set apart. And so the average person didn't feel like they were allowed or they could communicate to God for themselves or for others. And the scripture tells us, no, we're all priests. We communicate to God directly through what Jesus Christ has done on the cross. We don't need a priest anymore, Hebrews tells us. We're the priests. And the image he gives us is that our lives are built up as spiritual stones. A stone doesn't do much building, does it? No. This is very different. This is a living stone that is built up. And so for an exile, we are to build a spiritual halfway house out of our lives. We are to allow the gospel to build up what is inanimate, a stone, into something that is living and breathing and helping other people around us communicate to God, a spiritual halfway house. I with 100% of my being, believe that there is also a physical side to this. We see this in the scriptures. We see it in Jeremiah, for example, 29, where the exiles are in Babylon, and God writes a letter to them and says to them, no, I'm not taking you out of there. You're exiles. I've placed you there. Build homes, God tells them. Plant a garden, settle down, get married, and pray to the Lord for the peace and the prosperity to the city of which I have called you. You see, in terms of a spiritual halfway house that we are to be built up as exiles, I think it's physical and it's spiritual. Our house, biblically, is our mission field. And when it comes to this point, I just want to press a little bit further. Some of us are called to live in the country. Some of us are called to live in the suburbs. And some of us are called to live in the city. But I just want to say that we need more in the city. Many more. There aren't bullets whizzing by our windows, usually. Our kids get college paid for through the Pittsburgh Promise, if we can navigate a dysfunctional educational system. You can see a couple stars most nights. And you even get to pay an extra 2% on local tax for bigger potholes. So it's a good deal all around. The city campuses are actually laughing at that right now, in case you were wondering, here at this location. But seriously, if we could start seeing followers of Jesus Christ begin to move into the city, into every block of the 90 neighborhoods that make up Pittsburgh, and if we are loving one another deeply as exiles and building up a spiritual halfway house out of our lives, we will be rebranding Christianity. Tim Keller from New York, a pastor, recently tweeted this just 2 days ago. He says, if Christians left the areas of the city that were difficult to live in, what kind of Christianity is that? And so I pray more of our church sets up their spiritual halfway house in our city, and that they don't leave because it's difficult. My family, in our home, we've had a home invasion. We've had more theft than I care to recount, and I call 911 more than I call my mom. I'm not kidding. And I live in a neighborhood called Friendship. Yep, you get it. But it's our calling. I'm not complaining about it. I love it. And we're not going to leave because it's difficult. And if the city isn't your calling, hear me, great. Because there's thousands surrounding our city that also need you to be a spiritual halfway house where you're called. The point is this: we can as a church be as knowledgeable about the scriptures as possible. We could be as full of the gifts of the Spirit as possible. But if we're separated from the world, we aren't being a spiritual halfway house, we're being selfish. Urban or suburban, our home is our mission field. And we should have the table set, the porch lights on, the neighbors in our prayers. And church, if we build that, they will come. Because they all long to be loved deeply wherever we live. Loving each other deeply at least means setting up our lives as a spiritual halfway house for others. So church, let me ask you a question. Maybe you want to take a moment and write this down. Maybe you want to tweet it, make a note on your phone, whatever. How are you doing here? How's your home? Whether your home physically is temporary or permanent, would people call it a spiritual halfway house? What can you do to make it that? Where are you living now? And can that place possibly become a spiritual halfway house? Are there people in your life that need you to be this for them? And what's stopping you? Okay, next verses. Verse 9. You are a chosen race, Peter says, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may, underline this part, proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. The second thing the exiles do is they proclaim according to what they see with the light. We proclaim the excellencies of him who has saved us. Remember the first verse, to the exiles scattered. I often use the word deployed. We've been, church, deployed throughout the world. Not just in different types of neighborhoods, but in different domains of culture where we work, with different passions and gifts, yet all asked to proclaim the excellencies of him who has called us out of darkness as scattered exiles. And the way we do that is based upon how we've been scattered, where we've been deployed. And the differences between you and me and the person across the sanctuary from you at your location is what makes us the body of Christ. When we're all doing it together, there's a spectrum and it all looks different. The best example I can give of this is a tale of two Irish ancestors, two men who are related. And we have a picture of them for you. If you know who they are, keep it to yourself. One of these men, the older one, in 1759 realized that his Irish countrymen were just getting obliterated at the local pubs. They were. They were drinking way too much liquor, so much so they couldn't even stand. And as a Christian, he wanted to provide a solution of sobriety. But he knew that these guys wouldn't just stop drinking. So he came up with an idea for a drink that was loaded with nutrients and that would fill them up and have a thickness to it. So this man, Arthur, invented a drink named after his last name, Guinness. Can't make this stuff up. It's a Christian solution to a social problem. His great-great-great-grandson is the other gentleman in the picture. His name is Os Guinness. And if you are at all involved in politics in America, you know this name because he lives down outside of the D.C. area works in the Beltway, and he is involved and is written extensively from a Christian perspective on politics and truth in the public square. And I commend his books to you. They're phenomenal. And he is still, as he has been for decades, incredibly influential behind the scenes in the Beltway. And he's proclaiming light there. His great-great-great-grandfather proclaimed light in Irish pubs, and he's doing it on the Hill. Same family, same faith, but different deployments of different passions and different gifts in two completely different eras. You see, church, exiles proclaiming light into darkness will look different from one person to the next, but we are to walk as children of light and proclaim the excellencies of Christ wherever we've been deployed. And the body of Christ needs a man like Arthur Guinness as much as he needs a man like Oz. Now, church, you may be deployed as a preschool mother, and that's a serious calling. You may be deployed as a business executive. You may be deployed as a small group leader of high school students at our church. You may be a teacher, a professor. You may have a gift of prophecy or a passion for prayer. You may be helping people medically. You may be creating art. You may be living in a marginalized neighborhood or an affluent neighborhood. You may be passionate about the orphan crisis or passionate about caring for creation. And yes, you may be a Republican or a Democrat. I could do this all day. You get the point. We're all different. And we're all exiles, scattered and deployed, the body of Christ, to proclaim light into darkness. Church, how are you doing? Another moment to write. How are you doing proclaiming light into the darkness where you are deployed? Do you know where you're deployed? If you don't, have you set that before the Lord? Have you done it well? If not, is there something the church or someone else can do to help you? Would you invite someone in to help you understand how to live this out? Okay, next verse, last point. Verse 11, he says this, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor," we're going to come back to that, "as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." And then our verse, "Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." Here's the third and final point. Exiles both submit to and abstain from systems and structures of society. Peter, to talk about submitting first, tells them to be subjects to whom? Did you pay attention to it? The emperor. What happens about 2 years after this letter is written? That guy starts killing them. And it doesn't stop for about 300 years. And when the killing started, a few years after this letter was written, do you want to know what was happening with the letter in terms of the formation of the scriptures? They were being passed from church to church underground, and they were being transposed from one generation to the next. Do you know how easy it would have been over the course of 300 years to just take the emperor part out? The guy who was killing them, and they never took it out. It stayed in. They kept in a command of God because they believed he had told them to honor even the emperor. You think that was easy? No way. But as scholar N.T. Wright writes, he takes us back. He says, on the one hand, there was this other king, this king that required allegiance and the worship of sort that radically subverted the allegiance and worship demanded by Caesar. But on the other hand, the subversion in question was not that of an ordinary political revolutionary. And in the normal run of things, Christians must submit to legitimate authority. This meant that Jewish Christians must not align themselves with preparations for or acts of war against the Romans. Church, in the normal run of things, we must submit and honor authority, even authority like the emperor. And some of you today, I just want to challenge. Is it possible that you are flat out walking in disobedience to this scripture because you don't like your current authority, your president, your government, your elected officials? The vehement and hate-filled rhetoric that is out there has no business being in the lives of a Christian. We are to honor authority, period. But we don't have to go along with everything, because it's submit, but also abstain. We are to abstain from much that wages war against our soul, and the scriptures should be our measure on what that is. You can submit to authority and honor them while standing in godly opposition in grace and truth. You can. I referenced some passages from Daniel, who didn't eat the food of the king, yet was raised up to a position of favor, who didn't bow down to a structure of worship of idols and was eventually raised up again into a position of favor where they actually all bowed down to his God. It's possible. We can submit and abstain at the same time. So church, how are you doing here? How are you doing submitting to authority? How are you doing abstaining from the ways of culture that are around us, and even abstaining from that which wages war against our soul? You know, to put an end on this series, we began talking about these three different baselines. A baseline was defined as a minimum starting point used for comparisons. And we spent the first 2 weeks talking about these three baseline, the first baseline right here, talking about belief. Real intentional belief. The second week, we talked about experiencing suffering versus an inconvenience. And last week, Kent really hit hard this idea of areas of excess in our life. These three baselines make up what we call a disciple maker. Someone who's not just receiving, not just a disciple, but making other disciples. And I guess the whole point of this series, and I wanted to end this sermon with this question: Northway, what kind of Christianity will we choose? Will we choose the kind that is safe and comfortable by ourselves, where we barely survive? Or will we choose the kind that is built upon these baselines, where we grow and thrive together? A man by the name of G.K. Chesterton once said this: Christianity has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. Northway, may that not be true of us. May we show the world that Christianity can not only be tried, but it can cause us to thrive. And our city will thrive along with us. Wherever you're worshiping today, your campus leader is going to come on up, and everybody can stand at their location.